Today, we're diving into a tragedy that gripped New York City. The death of Jordan Neely on the subway and the trial of Daniel Penny, the man who choked him. This case has sparked so much debate, so much outrage, it feels like a reckoning, a moment where we have to ask, can this be a catalyst for real change in New York City?
Yeah, it's a question we have to grapple with. But to even begin to answer it, we need to understand the layers of this case, right? It's not just about this one man's death. It's about all the systems that failed him, the cracks it exposed, and yeah, the potential for a city, New York City, to learn from this, from its own wounds, really.
Let's start with the basic facts, with what happened. Jordan Neely, a homeless man, was experiencing mental distress and crying out for food and water on the subway. Then, Daniel Penny, a former Marine, intervenes, holds Neely in a chokehold, 15 minutes. It ends with Neely's death.
And the city explodes. I mean, the public was instantly divided. You had some who saw Penny as a hero, right? Like he was protecting the other passengers. But others saw him as a vigilante, someone who took the law into his own hands, and in doing so, took a life. The political responses to this, I think they were really revealing.
Mayor Adams and Governor Hochul, they both seem to focus on the need for consequences for behavior, but specifically from homeless individuals, not the root causes of homelessness, not mental health crises.
Yeah, and it wasn't just what they said. Remember Governor Hochul's statement? She said there should be consequences for behavior when talking about homeless individuals. And Mayor Adams, he advocated for more police in the subways. Like, that's the solution. That's the law and order ideology at work, prioritizing punishment and control over actually trying to fix the system.
So instead of asking, why is this person homeless, or how can we help someone who's struggling, we jump to, how do we control them?
Exactly. And that brings us to another really, really troubling part of this case, and that's the way working class anxieties were manipulated.
You're talking about that argument that the real victims were the working class, people on the subway who were just trying to get to work and were inconvenienced by Neely's behavior.
That's it. Liberals and conservatives both use this tragedy to create an image of hardworking New Yorkers, just regular people who are terrorized by this unhinged homeless man.
It's a powerful story, right? And it plays on very real fears about safety, but it's also deeply problematic.
Because it creates this us versus them narrative. The working class versus the homeless, as if those are fixed categories, and as if people struggling with homelessness aren't often part of the working class themselves.
You got it. It's a distraction, pure and simple. It lets politicians avoid talking about the policies they implemented that made inequality worse, that drove up housing costs, that pushed people into these desperate situations.
Because the reality is New York City is in an affordability crisis. Rising rents, evictions, homelessness. It's impacting a huge chunk of the population, people we think of as working class. And Mayor Adams. He's championing businesses and real estate developers while ignoring the needs of the people who are really struggling, the most vulnerable people in the city. His priority seems to be attracting investment, not making sure everyone who lives here is okay.
And this is fueling the frustration, the anger we see on the streets. Makes you wonder, are these just unfortunate consequences of living in a complicated city? Or is this deliberate?
To answer that, we need to look at the policies they made after this crisis. And there's one that really stands out. Mayor Adams expanding the mental hygiene law.
Right. This is the policy that allows for involuntary commitment of people who can't meet their basic needs because of mental illness.
Okay.
There's so much debate around it. Some say it's compassionate. Others say it's criminalizing mental illness.
It's both. There's a real desire to help people in crisis. I truly believe that. But it's also very dangerous because it could mean that people with mental health issues end up in the criminal justice system instead of getting real help and support.
And this is where that law and order approach just doesn't work. Instead of putting resources into mental health infrastructure, we're relying on law enforcement to deal with a complex social issue.
It's like putting a Band-Aid on a bullet wound. We're not fixing the problem, we're just containing it, and often in the most inhumane ways possible.
And it's a containment that seems to favor those considered deserving, those who fit the working class narrative, over those deemed undesirable, those struggling with homelessness and mental health.
And what's scary is how vague this policy is. Inability to meet basic needs. That's so broad, it's open to interpretation. Who decides what basic needs are? What's stopping this from being used to target people just because they're homeless or seem mentally distressed?
It's like we're not even trying to understand homelessness and mental illness. Instead, we make these fear-based decisions that just make the problems worse.
And that fear is a tool. Look at the rhetoric used by Adams and Hochul after Neely's death. They played on those anxieties, painting this picture of a city spiraling into chaos.
That same old playbook. use fear to justify more police, harsher policies, all while ignoring the things that could actually help. Social services, support systems.
And it's a cycle. Austerity measures and ignoring social services make poverty and crime worse, which gives them the excuse to expand law enforcement. It's a self-fulfilling prophecy that they created.
So where does this leave the people most impacted, the ones trying to survive in a city that seems to be turning against them?
That's the question that haunts me, and it leads us to the heart of this case. Can Jordan Neely's death be what finally changes things? Or will it just be another tragedy, another life lost in a city that values profit over people?
It's a heavy question. But before we get into that, let's talk about the resistance we saw after Neely's death. The protests, the defiance, the refusal to just accept this as business as usual.
Those reactions are so important. They're like seeds of hope in this bleak landscape.
Yeah.
They show us that even in a city as powerful as New York, people can make their voices heard, people can demand accountability, people can fight for something better.
And it's not just New York. We're seeing these movements everywhere,
Yeah.
all pushing back against criminalizing poverty, over-policing communities. From the fight against Cop City in Atlanta to the teachers' union in Chicago, people are rising up and demanding change.
These movements are a glimmer of hope. They make you think maybe Jordan Neely's death won't be in vain. But to understand that possibility, we need to look closer at the city as a site of struggle.
That's where we'll pick up in part 2 of this deep dive. We'll explore the history of resistance movements in cities, analyze what's happening in different places, and think about what it takes to build a movement strong enough to change the systems that create injustice.
So we were talking about the city as a site of struggle. I think it's a really important idea if we're going to understand the Jordan Neely case, but also just the fight for social justice in general.
Yeah, this idea is really interesting to me. You're saying cities aren't just places, they're like battlegrounds where these different forces are clashing, and that the fight for a more just society is actually playing out in these real, tangible ways.
Absolutely. I mean, think about it. Cities are the centers of power, right? You have wealth and poverty right next to each other. And it's where you really see the impact of political decisions. You could say it's where all the problems in our society are most visible.
So when we think about the Neely case, are you saying that what happened to him on the subway wasn't just random, it was a symptom of these bigger issues that are happening in the city?
Exactly. Think of the subway as a microcosm of the city itself. It's a place where everyone is forced together, people from all walks of life. And it's where those tensions between the haves and the have-nots, between those who feel safe and those who feel threatened, it's where all of that comes to a head.
And in that kind of environment, somebody who's homeless and struggling with mental health, they become a source of fear, not a person who needs help.
Yeah. And the way people react to that fear, well, it's often with this desire to control and punish. And that's encouraged by the way politicians talk about it, by the stories and the media tells. And we see that not just with Neely, but with this whole trend of criminalizing homelessness. It's like we're pushing people who are already struggling even further away.
We talked about Mayor Adams expanding the mental hygiene law.
Right.
Is that an example of this control and punish idea?
Oh, absolutely. It's a policy that on the surface seems like they're trying to help, but it relies on a system that's just not equipped to handle mental illness. It's like we're expecting law enforcement to take care of our most vulnerable people, and that's a system that's built to punish, not to help people heal.
And that takes us back to the protests. People took to the streets because they felt like the system was trying to silence them. They wanted justice for Jordan Neely and for everyone who's been treated this way.
And what's interesting is how those protests were directed at the city itself. Think about people jumping onto the subway tracks. That wasn't just symbolic. It was a way of disrupting the system, the infrastructure that represents the city's power and its economy.
They weren't just protesting one event, they were protesting the systems that made it possible.
Exactly. They were sending a message like, this city isn't working for us. It's putting profit over people. It's pushing us out, and we're not going to take it anymore.
And it's not just New York. We're seeing this kind of resistance in cities all over the country. You talked about the Cop City fight in Atlanta and the teachers union in Chicago. Can you tell us more about those? How do they connect to what's happening here in New York?
Well, it's really interesting because each of these movements is fighting against something specific to their city. In Atlanta, it's police brutality and environmental destruction. In Chicago, it's about funding for education and workers' rights. But the thing they all have in common is this understanding that the city is where these battles have to be fought.
So they're fighting for different things, but they're all fighting in the same arena.
Yeah, and they're using similar tactics too. Direct action, disruption, building coalitions, and refusing to be silenced. They're all challenging the idea that we just have to accept things as they are, that we can't change the systems that control our lives.
It sounds like what you're describing is this new wave of resistance movements in cities. Movements that aren't just reacting to things that happen, but are trying to dismantle the systems that cause those things to happen.
That's exactly what's so exciting about what's happening right now. You see all these different struggles coming together. People are realizing that the fight for social justice has to happen locally, in the cities where the power is.
But how do these movements actually lead to change? Protests are important, but how do we actually shift the power and create a city that's fair for everyone?
That's the big question, isn't it? And there's no easy answer. But I think we can learn a lot by looking at what these movements are doing. They're trying new ways of organizing, they're using technology to connect with each other, and they're building coalitions across different communities and issues.
You mentioned coalitions. Can you give us an example of how that's working?
Sure. Look at the fight against Cop City in Atlanta. It's brought together environmental activists, people fighting for racial justice, police abolitionists, and community organizers. They don't necessarily agree on everything, but they all agree that this project is bad for the city.
So it's about finding common ground, where different struggles overlap and where they can have a bigger impact by working together.
Exactly. And that's why the city is such an important place for these struggles, because in the city, those overlaps are everywhere. We're constantly interacting with each other, even if it's just passing someone on the street. We share the same spaces, the same resources.
So even if we don't always see it, we're all connected in some way.
That's right. And that connection is both a challenge and an opportunity. It means that what one group does can affect the whole city. It means that injustice in one community affects everyone. And it means that when we work together, when we build solidarity across different communities and issues, we can create a really powerful force.
That's a powerful image, but it also feels overwhelming. How do we even start to build that kind of movement, especially in a city as big and complicated as New York? Where do we begin?
I think the first step is realizing that change takes time. It's a long process, and it's not always going to be easy or straightforward, but it starts with small acts of resistance. It starts with talking to our neighbors, learning about the issues, and educating others.
So it's not about waiting for someone else to lead. It's about each of us taking responsibility for the change we want to see.
Exactly. And there are a lot of ways to do that. It could be talking to a friend about these issues. It could be volunteering our time or donating to organizations that are fighting for social justice. It could be showing up at a protest. It could even be running for office or supporting candidates who we believe in.
Sounds like you're saying that real change starts at the grassroots level, with people taking action in their own communities.
Yeah. Because that's where the power really is. When enough people start demanding change, when enough voices come together, those in power have to listen.
We saw that power in the protests after Jordan Neely died. People from all walks of life came together to demand justice, to say that things have to change.
And that's the spirit we need to keep alive. Because this fight for a more just and equitable city, it's not a sprint, it's a marathon. And we can only win it if we run it together.
We've been talking about the city as this battleground, this place where the fight for social justice is happening. And we've seen how people have risen up in protest after Jordan Neely's death. It was such a powerful response to a system that many feel has let them down.
Yeah, and it's not just isolated incidents, these protests. It feels like there's this wave of movements happening in cities all across the country. People are demanding real change, a more just future. Like, look at the fight against Cop City in Atlanta, or what the teachers union is doing in Chicago.
There's this real sense of urgency with these movements, of feeling like things can't go on like this. But just protesting doesn't always lead to change. So how do we bridge that gap? How do we go from outrage to actual progress?
Strategy, tactics. These movements are trying new things, learning from past struggles, but also adapting to what it's like to fight for change in a 21st century city. It's not easy.
We keep coming back to this idea of coalitions.
Yeah.
How are these movements bringing different communities and different issues together?
It's interesting because it's not always about agreeing on everything. It's more about recognizing that they need each other. Like, take the fight against Cop City in Atlanta. You have environmental activists who are worried about the forest. Then you have people fighting against police brutality. And then community organizers who are working to improve neighborhoods.
Their goals might be different, but they see how their struggles are connected.
Right. It's like they understand that the same systems that are destroying the environment are also responsible for mass incarceration and economic inequality. And when they come together, their message is stronger. They have more power.
So it's not just about having a lot of people, it's about being strategic.
Yeah.
Finding those places where different fights overlap and where working together can make the biggest difference.
Yeah, exactly. And technology is a huge part of that now. Social media helps these movements connect with each other, share information, plan actions. It's amazing how much easier it is to organize and mobilize now compared to just a few decades ago.
And we're seeing all these new online tools specifically for activism. Apps that help you find protests, websites for crowdfunding, even things that show you patterns of injustice using data.
It's like activism is becoming more democratic. It's easier for people to get involved in a way that works for them. And it makes it a lot harder for those in power to control the story and silence people.
But coalitions are just one piece of the puzzle. How do these movements keep going? How do they keep people engaged for the long haul? How do they prevent burnout?
It's really important to listen to the people who are most affected by these injustices. They're the ones who are living with the consequences every single day. Their stories have to be at the center of the movement.
So it's not just about having allies. It's about making sure the people who are actually experiencing these problems are the ones leading the way.
Yeah. And it's about moving beyond just protesting. It's about building something new, something better, like mutual aid networks, community gardens, free clinics, even worker-owned businesses.
So you're talking about creating an alternative, a different way of doing things outside the systems that are causing these problems.
In a way, yes. It's like we can't just wait for those in power to do the right thing. We have to create the world we want, even if it's just in our own communities, one step at a time.
That's a really inspiring idea, but can it really work? Can these grassroots efforts really challenge the powerful systems that control our cities?
I think so. Maybe not by overthrowing those systems completely, but by showing people there's another way, by building a movement that's too strong to be ignored.
It's a long game, for sure, but the stakes are too high to give up. This fight for a better city, it's worth it. It's about our communities, our children, what it means to be human.
And everyone has a role to play in this fight, whether it's marching in the streets, organizing at work, donating to organizations, or even just having tough conversations with the people around us. We can all contribute to building a movement that can really make a difference.
We started this deep dive asking if Jordan Neely's death could spark change in New York City. And while we still don't know the answer to that, one thing's for sure. His death has ignited something. It's forced us to see the injustices that exist, and it's inspired so many people to take action.
The path forward is going to be hard. There will be setbacks, moments when we lose hope. But there will also be victories, moments of solidarity, moments that remind us why we keep fighting.
And in those moments, we'll find the strengths to keep going, to keep building, to keep pushing for change, to keep fighting for a city and a world where every single life matters, where everyone's voice is heard, and where justice wins.
Thanks for joining us for this deep dive. I hope this conversation inspires you to keep learning, thinking, and acting, because the fight for a better future starts with each one of us.